So today, we're very pleased to host best-selling author and journalist Sathnam Sangera to discuss his latest book, Empireworld, How Britain Imperialism Has Shaped the Globe. Sangera's latest book shifts his focus away from the imprint of empire on Britain to consider how British imperialism has shaped the modern world. Grappling with topics like the establishment of tea plantations, to the environmental destruction, the book argues that an honest conversation about Britain's history and legacies of empire is long overdue. As well as authoring books on empire, Sangera has also made documentaries, including The Massacre That Shook the Empire and The Empire State of Mind, both on Channel 4. Sangera will be joined today by Katie Donington, Senior Lecturer in Black, Caribbean and African History at the Open University, and a specialist in history and legacies of the British transatlantic slave trade. So without any further ado, thank you very much, Katie and Sathnam. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Saz, for the introduction, and thank you so much to Sathnam for joining us today at the OU. So without further ado, I'm going to get started with the questions because we've got some time together, but I'm sure that people in the audience will also be very keen to ask their questions. So this book has come out, I think, and as well as your previous book, Empireland, they've come out at a sort of very particular time in terms of the ways in which histories of Britain and its empire are being kind of thought about, spoken about, particularly in the context of what's become known as the culture wars. So I wondered whether or not you could tell me a little bit about what it was that first made you want to write these books, and also what made you want to do it right now.
Great, and thanks for that question, and also thanks for the introduction, Sass. Basically, I got to a certain age in my 40s, quite late, where I realized that empire explained a lot about Britain, not least our multiculturalism. I mean, I grew up with a narrative that brown people came here uninvited, and that's still I think still the narrative now. And it was a major moment in my life when I realized that the people on the Windrush, they came as British citizens, and that we're a multicultural country today, largely because we had a multicultural empire. But I also realized that, that I'm a Sikh. The Sikh identity was massively shaped by the British, the demographics, the way we took the side of the British during the empire meant that the British fetishized us as this kind of martial race. And that's the prism through which the Sikhs see themselves. So there was this entity that shaped my life, shaped my country. It also shaped so many things around us. The fact that we drink tea, the invention of rum, the existence of entire nations like Nigeria, Pakistan, entire cities like Nairobi, Melbourne, and Calcutta, patterns of tax avoidance, white feminism, companies like BP, Shell. It's absolutely everywhere. You cannot pick up the newspaper either without coming across the legacy of the British Empire, whether it's a situation in Israel, Palestine, which we were involved in creating, Yemen, Myanmar, Kashmir, Sudan. So I really do think that if you want to understand the world, you've got to understand the British Empire.
Well, I can agree with you more. Whenever I am out with my family, they always discover that we're only a couple of conversations away from me sharing a story, a slavery-related story, a local history, or whatever it is we're looking at the time. So when I was reading your book, particularly when you were talking about kind of being in the Caribbean, and it's just so inescapable, and you're supposed to be on holiday, but you can't help but see, these traces of the past. And I mean, in the Caribbean, it's not just traces, right? It's so fundamental to the history and identity of people. It's inescapable, really. But I could very much relate to that inability once you start seeing these things, whether at home or abroad. You just can't help but begin to relate it back to that kind of that story of empire and its effects today. So I wanted to begin by asking you about some of your ideas around decolonization, because it's in the start of your book, for those that haven't read it, kind of it sort of thinks about what decolonization might mean, particularly because there's been such kind of tense debates about the meaning of decolonization in Britain, where I think it's had a very kind of specific set of arguments, particularly around things like higher education, the notion of decolonizing history, but it means different things to different people in different places. So I wondered if you could say a little bit about how you, in the process of writing this book, came to understand and think about what decolonization meant, both in Britain, but also in particular in this book, in formerly colonized spaces.
Yeah, I mean, I think most people in Britain are aware that there's actually an official program of decolonization happening in India. I mean, the BJP government are massively into it. So it extends to, demolishing imperial monuments, but also building their own, renaming places with indigenous names or after Indian heroes, trying to teach medical degrees in non-English languages. And all this stuff is worthwhile. It's about, communities rediscovering their dignity after a history of colonization. But I conclude that ultimately it can't happen, because what is India going to do? Is it going to get rid of cricket? Are you going to delete Nigeria from the map? Are they going to stop drinking tea? Because tea was something that the British turned into a mass market product in India. Ultimately, you can't do it. It's like I say in the book, it's like trying to take the egg out of a baked cake. Also, I feel like the word decolonization puts people's backs up, because the way we talk about it in Britain, it implies the deletion of, the set texts, William Shakespeare, all of that stuff. When actually, I don't think decolonization is about that. For me, it's about widening intellectual discourse. It's about looking at things from a new angle. It's about reading Jane Austen and Mansfield Park, and then actually thinking about how that invites a discourse about slavery, something that I wasn't told about when I studied it for A level. It's about talking about World War I and World War II, and talking about the imperial contribution. Again, something I was never taught about. So for me, it's about widening the curriculum. It's about more knowledge. And I think if you frame it in that positive way, it's less hard to kick against. But if you use the phrase decolonization, I think it makes lots of people pointlessly cross.
Yeah, I think that idea that somehow it's taking something away, that something is being lost rather than something being given and being added, I think that's the tension there. And oftentimes that's kind of that's what comes through when people are talking about the fear of sort of having their heritage taken away from them, or having their history taken away from them. And to sort of quote Donald Trump, who was talking about it in relation to bringing down the statues in Virginia, it's that notion of loss, when in fact, actually, when you talk about Britain and Empire, it's actually, additional information. It's part of our history, right? It's actually a broadening of what it means when we talk about our kind of shared history, rather than a sort of, again, you hear the sort of the notion of kind of, replacement, that you can only have one or the other. It's a kind of zero sum game. So both of your books then, I think, deal with to some degree, with, I think, this idea of both imperial nostalgia, so kind of remembering in these very kind of selective, particular ways, but also imperial forgetting. And I wondered if you could say a little bit more about how you thought that combination of things of forgetting and remembering functioned in formerly colonized spaces, as well as in the ways that kind of Britain itself engages with its past.
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to be nostalgic about Empire, by definition, you're going to be amnesiac about it as well. You're going to have amnesia, because it's not something that invites being nostalgic about, because it was deeply dark in many ways. I think I've slightly changed my viewpoint with my second book on this, because I talked a lot about amnesia in the first book, but actually what I've realized is that there was a deliberate program of concealing information by the British state, which sounds like a conspiracy theory, and I've always resisted it. But when I looked into the foundation of Nigeria, and the British men who set up Nigeria, deleted the documentation as they went along. There was said to be a pool of smoke over Delhi because of all the documents that were being destroyed. You had Operation Legacy, which was a deliberate effort by the British state to conceal what happened. And you saw it with the Mau Mau trial when the British state were forced to go to court to answer for what happened with the Mau Mau in Kenya. A bunch of documents appeared out of nowhere. And you see it now with Lord Mountbatten, the final viceroy of India. You know, this is partition is a defining world event. Up to 2 million people died. And still, Lord Mountbatten's documents are not available to historians. I think they're still officially secret. There's a court case happening. And I think what that shows is that there was actually a deliberate effort to conceal what happened by the British state. But then you add the casual amnesia, which I think was promoted by things like the creation of the Commonwealth. We had the Empire, and suddenly we have the Commonwealth. We don't have to talk about the Empire anymore. It's like nothing ever happened. It enabled us to act like nothing had happened. And I think this is why it's taken so long for historians in the conversation to catch up with what did actually happen, you know. And it's why I think people get so upset now, because what happened was concealed and viewed through rose-tinted windows for so many decades.
Yeah, it's interesting that that dynamic between kind of forgetting and the sort of active process of hiding something. When I was involved with making the documentary Britain's Forgotten Slave Owners, we debated for a really long time, should it be called Britain's Hidden Slave Owners or Britain's Forgotten Slave Owners, because there was that sort of tension there. And in the end, we went with Forgotten because these records were actually kind of open to the public. Anyone could go and access them. They were right there. They just had been neglected to some degree. Eric Williams had used them a bit, but you know, to all intents and purposes, this history was kind of in the open, but there had been this kind of active sense of forgetting. And I think Stuart Hall described it as a kind of active process, that it wasn't sort of, you know, this absent-mindedness that Bernard Porter talks about in his books, but actually it was a, you know, kind of an active process itself. So I wanted to kind of think about then, I guess, that shift between your first book and your second book, which the first book focusing more on kind of Empire and Britain, and the second book focusing more on Empire out, you know, in the world. And I just wondered, you know, because in your conclusion, you do come back to Britain again. And I wondered to what degree you think that the conversation needs to change. I mean, just before people started coming in, we were talking about Kemi Badenoch's kind of statement about when she goes to speak to other countries, you know, they come with these particular perspectives on the British Empire, but she doesn't agree with them. And of course, she thinks we should ignore them. But actually, it makes me think, and your book makes me think, that this has been such an insular conversation in terms of Britain thinking about its own past, but not really listening to or connecting with the ways in which other countries are formulating their ideas around empire and its legacies. You know, the conversation about statues, for example, you know, never involved talking about the ways in which the Caribbean memorializes transatlantic enslavement. It was always about the statues in this country. So how has engaging with empire in former colonial spaces, how do you think that can reshape the conversation that Britain is currently having just with itself?
I dropped out there for a few. I got your question, but can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. I dropped out for about 10 seconds. But yeah, I think the problem with our conversation, and this is something David Olusoga said, is that our conversation on empire in Britain has always been a monologue. And it's got to turn into a dialogue because the world is desperately trying to engage us on this. You saw it at the coronation where all the leaders of these countries came along and wanted to talk about reparations. They wanted to talk about how they didn't want the King Charles as their monarch anymore. And they wanted to talk about repatriating loot. But we just had our head in our sands. And it keeps coming up. I mean, you saw it very dramatically with Prince William and Princess Kate's visit to Barbados, to the Caribbean 2 years ago, which is where my second book starts, because I'd just been on holiday there. And the huge gap between the way they acted, you know, standing on the back of Land Rovers, waving at locals, touching children through a wire fence. And suddenly something happened that even the right-wing press realized that this was no longer suitable. There was nothing unusual about that royal tour. It was like every other royal tour going back a century. It's just that suddenly we've realized it needs to be a dialogue. Suddenly we're hearing what the Caribbean are saying about the legacies of slavery, and it looks awkward. And this is why after that, there was never another royal tour like that. The next royal tour that happened was recently to Kenya. And that was actually a very different royal tour where King Charles talked about what happened with the Mau Mau and the terrible things that were done during the British Empire in Kenya. It was at the foreground of the royal tour. And this just needs to happen. It was a very healthy royal tour, but relatively speaking. And I think we have a better relationship with Kenya. But we just need to do that for about 50 other countries. We need to think about what we did when the last time we turned up, because they remember it, whereas we just have our heads in the sands.
Yeah, it's one of the things that always strikes me when we're thinking about international relations, the degree to which a total kind of denial or shut down about any of the negative aspects of empire is such an impediment to building relationships with other countries, because it just, like you said, it stops dialogue. It stops the ability to be able to meet one another as equals. And when we, again, going back to this idea of shared history and heritage, if it is shared, then the power dynamics of how to tell stories about the past actually needs to be shared as well. It can't just be one group's version of events is the dominant narrative. It's got to be about that conversation that you're having. I thought it was quite interesting, actually, and I was quite surprised towards the end of the book. You were sort of talking about the ways that the Commonwealth might, and also indeed the royal family, might play a role in shaping those conversations. What do you think that those institutions could do in terms of?
Yeah, I mean, we've got a weird situation where we've got a government which has had embarked on a culture war on empire. It's very right wing on these things, but the royal family is not actually that right wing. I mean, it's quite hard for anyone to be that right wing, frankly. But they have to listen because they're the head of a commonwealth, so they have to listen to the Commonwealth countries all the time. They have to compare themselves to other royal families in Europe, and the other royal families in Europe are doing quite a lot. They're also the head of a multicultural, multi-faith nation, so they have to listen to the descendants of the colonized in Britain. So the conversations I've had with the royal household, like the members of the staff there, is that they are way more woke, way more woke than the government. And actually, with the Church of England, talking about giving up to £1 billion in reparations, I've heard that the royal family actually want to get involved in that, and I'm not surprised because they have to, because of it's where they stand. If they're going to represent the Commonwealth and our modern society, they have to get involved in these things. So, yeah, I do have a more positive view about the royal family on this theme than I do of the government, which is not saying much, to be honest.
Just to sort of sticking with that idea then of the potential for a government role, and actually this is a question rolled over from the last time that I saw you speak, which I didn't actually get an opportunity to ask, so I'm just going to take that opportunity now. The way that conversations about empire have been very, very shaped by I think the right-wing press and some very right-wing politicians as well, certainly in public anyway. Do you think that if there is a change of government, that there will be a change in attitude towards the ways in which we engage with empire? And I'm thinking particularly around education policy. Do you see or can you imagine a different kind of conversation that might arise? I was watching Keir Starmer's sort of progressive patriotism speech that he did for St. George's Day, and he was talking about the kind of inclusive stories that we might tell about Britain. So I wondered if you had any thoughts about whether or not it's possible that we might see some shifts.
Yeah, I think about it a lot because I've ended up caught in the middle of the culture wars, and it's sold me a lot of books, but it's also made me miserable, and I'd like things to change. I actually feel optimistic. I feel that now Keir Starmer is very, very conservative in his approach to politics, but he did attack the Tories for the culture wars and defended the National Trust about a month or two ago, which I think was an important moment, because that story, the obsession with the national trust and colonialism is insane. And it was good to see him stand up for it. But also, I think another reason I think it's going to change is because our politicians and politics do not represent our country. Our country, all the surveys suggest that we are actually quite liberal on all these issues. I think something like 3/4 of people, according to a recent survey, think it's a good idea to teach kids about colonialism and empire. I think something like, is it 2/3 of people think we should apologize for slavery? I think around 40% of people think we should pay reparations. 44% of people think the royal family should pay reparations, which is incredible given I don't think most people even realize the royal family were involved in slavery through the Royal African Company. So I think our country socially is getting more and more liberal all the time. But our politics is just trapped in this echo chamber of culture war, right-wing madness. And I do think it's over. I feel like Suella, Kemi, and Jacob Rees-Mogg are still going through the motions, but even their hearts aren't into it. It's all about trying to be the next leader of the Conservative Party. I don't think it's landing. The culture war's never been tested in an election. Let's see how well the Empire culture war is going to turn out in the next election. I suspect not very well.
Yeah, I mean, it's I think it's the whole issue with the sort of with the National Trust. I mean, some surveying was done by Policy Exchange in the immediate aftermath of it, and they surveyed, I don't know what the size of the cohort was, but 73% of them said that the National Trust should do more to talk about slavery and colonialism, and I don't imagine that was the outcome of the survey that Policy Exchange were hoping for.
But Policy Exchange are involved absolutely in every single one of these culture wars. You know, they are egging this on. So for them to say that, report that, says a lot.
I'm not sure it gladdened their heart when they had to actually publish the report, but and also, of course, National Trust membership actually didn't decline in the wake of that. Again, if you're looking at kind of the hard metrics of how these things are playing out for particular kinds of institutions. But you were saying there that this was, this book has been, or these two books have been, both extremely rewarding to produce, but very, very challenging, particularly in terms of kind of personal attacks. And, we've again seen some of this stuff play out in the press, for example, with the attacks on Corinne Fowler. And I wondered if you wanted to say a little bit about, because in your book, you talk about how cautious you are about having a kind of chapter on race. And I wonder whether or not you might say a little bit about your, the way that you approach that chapter and how your kind of personal experiences, having written both the previous book and with people knowing that this one was coming out, how they shaped the way that you decided to put that chapter together.
Yeah, it's been bad. It's been bad. I think David Olusoga gets it worse. I mean, it's a matter of record that he has a bodyguard at some live events. Corinne Fowler, has had to call the police at certain times, is libeled in the press regularly still, became too scared to leave the house at a certain point. I stopped doing live events because of the shouting. And it was quite something when the second book came out, because the first book did quite well. And so when a sequel is coming out in the middle of a culture war, the knives are out. So before the book even came out, there were 3 or 4 vicious reviews on right-wing websites, like unbelievable. I actually didn't read them, but I was told they were utterly vicious. But it does affect you as a writer to know that that's going to happen, and so that's why my bibliography is so long. I wanted to turn up with the receipts. I don't want to face the accusation I'm making stuff up, which frankly certain historians on the right do. They don't turn up with the receipts and they get away with it. Also, I guess with that chapter on racism, I am so careful in it, and I add so many caveats. So I do argue that the British Empire was the single most influential incubator and propagator and refiner of white supremacy in the history of the planet. But I have to add really important caveats, like not all the racism in the world can be explained by the British Empire. It was European colonization in general which led to modern racism, of which British colonialism was a part. Officially, the British Empire was non-racist. It's just in actual practice, it wasn't. And also racism obviously varies around the world. You know, American racism is different from British racism. So I had to add all those caveats, but I also dismantle them all and come to the conclusion that obviously British Empire, at least in the 19th century and the early 20th century, was proudly racist. And you see it. I try to make people read the poem White Man's Burden by Rudyard Kipling. You know, read that poem. And that poem was written by one of our most famous imperialists to America, urging them to do in the Philippines what we had done in our colonies. And it's all there, plain to see. And actually, the Americans responded very well to that. The president at the time thought it was a great poem. So it did, yeah. With the white supremacy of empire, totally inspired white supremacy in all sorts of places around the world.
Just linking to that, you bring up, I think, a really important kind of idea, which I think is a very contentious one, and which, again, you know, when you were talking about decolonization, saying it puts people's backs up, but in relation to your chapter on race, you talked about the difference between a sense of kind of white guilt, so the racialization, I guess, of kind of notions of guilt and shame, and the idea of kind of a collective responsibility when it comes to empire. So it made me think of Catherine Hall's work on, she has got a piece on denial and disavowal, where she talks about kind of the ways in which people benefited from empire, but at a distance, and we need to find ways in which it doesn't become this kind of this sense of personal responsibility, but people realize the ways in which they are what she describes as, and I think she's borrowing terminology here from Michael Rothberg's theorization of Holocaust perpetrators as being implicated subjects. So not directly responsible, but being implicated within these histories. And I think your book makes that kind of, it really usefully shifts from this kind of sense of the sort of idea or the unproductiveness of white guilt, and moves it towards this sense of collective responsibility, particularly I thought in the chapter on linking to climate change, and the idea that actually, you know, we have these collective legacies that need to be dealt with, you know, in collectively responsible ways. So I wondered if you thought if there was anything more that you kind of wanted to say about the ways in which you thought like a kind of collective response from Britain, whether it's around climate change, you know, reparations, political instability. What do you think are the possibilities for collective action in response to imperial legacies?
Yeah, no, I totally do believe. I think no one living is to blame for what happened in British Empire. It's pointless. It doesn't get us anywhere. Often people imply that that's what you're trying to make them do, feel guilty. It's got nothing to do with that. It's got nothing to do with your pride or your shame. It's not about your feelings. It's about our national standing up and being more grown up in the modern world. As a nation, we are forever lecturing the world about democracy and about the environment and about human rights, with zero reflection about our distinctly patchy records on democracy, the environment, and human rights during the empire. And just because we don't remember what we did doesn't mean the world doesn't remember. You know, I remember Tony Blair in his memoir saying when he handed back Hong Kong to the Chinese that he was only dimly aware of the history. The Chinese aren't only dimly aware of the history of the Opium Wars. They remember it. They teach it. They talk about the century of humiliation. And it's just embarrassing that we're turning up around the world pontificating, sometimes on very specific issues like Kashmir or Israel-Palestine, where we helped create the situation in the first place. And it's embarrassing that we don't reflect on it because the world does. So if we want to, after Brexit, reestablish new relationships with the world, we've got to do so in a grown-up way, remembering how the world sees us. So for me, that is what matters more than anything else. And when the royal family starts talking about animal conservation, which it does all the time, it should reflect on, you know, the fact that the Buckingham Palace is full of ivory, that there are animal skins all over in every palace as a result of all the animals killed in empire by actual royals. There's a family that needs to take responsibility. But even then, there's no individual in the royal family who needs to take responsibility.
So I might just sneak in one last question from me, and then I'm going to hand it over to the floor for people to ask questions. So I wanted to ask, kind of in terms of, you've clearly done loads of research, you've clearly come across loads and loads of different stories. Is there one particular kind of example or story from Empire that you thought really kind of summed up some of the points that you wanted to make, some of the things that you wanted to say with this book? And if so, what is it?
Yeah, I guess my ultimate argument in the book is that opposite things can be true at the same time. I think the British Empire resulted in democracy in lots of places. It resulted in geopolitical chaos. It involved slavery and anti-slavery, involved the free press and press censorship. There's a bunch of contradictions. And for me, the thing that epitomizes it is national parks. So British imperialists set up national parks in places like Australia and New Zealand and East Africa to protect the environment and to protect animals. You could say, oh, there's a positive legacy of the British Empire, except they often only set up these national parks because they had destroyed the environment in the first place, or they'd hunted animals to the point of near extinction in the first place. Sometimes these people set up the national parks because they wanted to carry on hunting the animals. And then the indigenous people in these national parks weren't allowed to live their lives in the way they wanted to because of this new creation, this new entity of the national park. So overall, would you say national parks were a positive or negative legacy of the British Empire? I don't think you can say it was either. It was just really complicated. And I think that the national parks as a legacy epitomize how complicated and complex and contradictory the legacies of the British Empire can be.